Our passage for today is Mark chapter 7. And we've been going through a series in Mark, and so we'll be going into chapter 7. I think we're kind of clocking over to the halfway point of Mark. But our scripture reading is Mark chapter 7, not Mark chapter 6 up there, but it's Mark chapter 7, verses 1 to 13. And we'll be reading from the ESV. Now, when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as washing of cups and pots and copper and vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men.' And he said to them, 'You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is korban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do." This is the word of the Lord. The great truth kind of nestled in our passage today is in verse 9. And it's Jesus' very words. And he says, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition." You have a fine way. I kind of think of it's like fine dining, right? Fine wine. It's a refined way. It's a refined practice. It's aged. It's done again and again. There's a fine way in which these Pharisees have, for over a long period of time, practiced this craft. Jesus' words confront us with an uncomfortable truth that may be hard to admit. That my tendency, or our tendency, is that we reject God's ways for our own. It's not just a problem for the Pharisees, but it's our human condition, I believe. We constantly look for loopholes. It's within our nature. And one of the most dangerous things we do in our nature is that we can even make good things. We can use good things and even godly things as a way to push God out of the center of the equation and to further our agenda. This is what idolatry really is. We use whatever we can to fill our hearts. And even that was something that was meant for God, we can use it for our agenda, and we can fill our hearts, and we could misconstrue it for our own benefit. Our sin is not just what we do. Sin is not just what we do or don't do. But sin is actually a position, a disposition. It's a habit of my heart to do things without God. I can even do God things without God. You know, this passage is a bit of a wrestle, because I think many of us, especially those of us that have grown up in the church and are very familiar with the Christian culture and Christian journey, I'm sure you can relate with this. As a pastor, I surely relate with this, because this passage points right at me, right? For people who are so familiar with church and religion, that like the Pharisees in our day and in our passage today, we get so wrapped up in doing things the right way. We get so wrapped up in the practices and the rhythms, and we kind of just get lost in the right way we do things, that we really lose sight somewhere along the line of why we do it in the first place. The Pharisees had their traditions. Just like we have our church habits, we have Sundays, or we have our prayer meetings, we have our missions, we have our giving time, worship time, we have our church habits. But in our passage today, we see that Jesus calls them out. Jesus calls them out not because the traditions are necessarily bad or wrong, but because they've replaced relationship with ritual. They've replaced the essence of what this is all about. And this is the title of our passage, of our sermon today, and that's Ritual to Relationship. But it's kind of humbling to start from this place, I think. For me, it was humbling to kind of think through this passage because the first person I have to think about is myself. To be open to maybe the idea or maybe this truth that maybe I'm more like the Pharisees than I am the disciples of the crowd. That I'm more prone, more inclined towards becoming like the Pharisees than the crowds or even like Jesus, right? It's like when we read ourselves into the story in 21st century, we like to be the main protagonist, right? We love Avengers. We love a good superhero story where the protagonist wins, right? And it's like the temptation is to think and see the passage and be like, yeah, I'm more like the disciples. Like that's my story arc. But when we've been in the church for so many years, the temptation is to kind of just gloss over this part and paint the Pharisees as kind of this like group that will never become like. We don't relate with them. But there is kind of a honest, like keeping us honest kind of moment today, I think, with this passage where we're not immune. We also have fine ways of rejecting God's way. All right, may I speak on my behalf? I have a fine way in which I make my way, and not God's way, my way. I reject God's way. Even when I want to do right. Even when I intend to do right, right? If religion was all about intentions, everyone will be a very faithful servant and follower of Jesus. If intentions were our faith, everyone has good intentions. Dime a dozen good intentions. Even when I intend to do good, what's natural for me is that it kind of alludes to like Paul. Romans chapter 7. I want to do what's right, but I do what's wrong, what I don't want to do. And the thing that I don't want to do, I do. And it's this internal wrestle within our souls where we do the very things that we don't want to do and we don't do the very things that we want to do. There's something wrong. There's something broken. There's a nature. There's something fallen within all of us. It's not just the Pharisees. We have a fine way of rejecting God's way for our ways. And even when we're the most established and, respected member of the church and everyone's like, oh yeah, that guy is like really holy and she's amazing, like been in the church, like you might have the platform. Even for people with titles and reputation, we have a fine way of rejecting God's way for our way. It's just a sin. It's just a brokenness that's in all of us. And so the journey to spiritual formation is a journey of a believer becoming more and more transformed from the inside out. Not just in the practices that we do, not the external specs, not what I'm known for, but who I'm becoming when nobody else sees. Even if it's just from one degree to another, if I'm becoming more like Christ from within, from my core, this is spiritual formation. This is discipleship. This is what it means to follow Jesus. Dallas Willard, he says this, and Dallas Willard is like an author, pastor, philosopher. He's since passed away not too long ago, but he's one of the main voices in spiritual formation, and he speaks very much into, and spiritual formation is just the process in which we are being transformed to become more like Christ. And what he says is the greatest enemy of intimacy with God is actually service for God. Whoa, that sounds intense. Is that even right? It sounds kind of wild to say the greatest enemy. It might be one of the greatest enemies, but the greatest. And it's like Dallas Willard says that actually what prevents us from getting closer with God, in relationship with God, in communion with God, is what we do for God. Because we so easily think that what we mistaken and we misunderstand that our relationship and my transformation is based upon what I do for God. and not what he's done for me and what work he's doing into the core of me. See, the greatest distraction, I would say, maybe if I would change the answer, maybe I'll change the quote a little bit and I'll say the greatest distraction from our intimacy with God can sometimes be service for God. We serve God so much. We're so involved with church. We have this title. We're part of this ministry, this church, mentored by this person, done this course. And how many of, like, in the modern church, how many courses and how many things can we buy? It's so accessible to us. But how many of you guys know you could do the best courses in the world, but you could still lie, be angry, be jacked up, and leave the church and deconstruct? Like, we've seen that through COVID. All of those external practices, they draw us closer to God, but they don't necessarily transform us. And so the greatest distraction can be actually what I've done for God, because I start misunderstanding and thinking that what I've done for God gives me a place and puts me in a certain level where I'm transformed. But the reality is, these things can distract us from God himself. The journey of spiritual formation is about the slow, steady transformation of our hearts. It's a long journey, guys. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a long journey. We think that we get saved and then we go to heaven. And it's like, until then, we're like, okay, we got that grace card. So it just kind of, I coast. But no. From the moment I'm saved to the moment I see Jesus face to face, it's a slow and steady growth and transformation of my heart. It's not necessarily, there is important things that we do for God, our mission for God. But I think sometimes we can miss the most important thing, the greatest commandment, to love God, to love our neighbor, to be transformed myself, to be in relationship myself with God. The greatest commandment and the greatest commission together should go together. It shouldn't go separate. And so what we see in our passage is a lot of these Pharisees, they know how to talk the talk. They know how to do the deed. They know how to be religious. But when it comes to the slow and steady transformation of their hearts, I don't know if they're aware of this process. I don't know if they've entered into this process. See, spiritual formation can be a very slow process, and it can be a very painful process. It's becoming more authentic and real. Honest. I am still struggling with this. God. I know I thought I might have kind of graduated from that point, might have graduated from that addiction, might have graduated from that struggle that I had when I was younger, but I'm back in it, God. And sometimes the shame and the guilt can keep us from really opening up our hearts to God. We can do these things and stay busy and keep the wheel running so that we don't have to face the reality. But the transformation doesn't happen if we just keep the momentum going. We sometimes have to slow down and crack open. Just let the process happen. Let the mess come out. Let the reality of where my heart really is come out. Spiritual formation is a movement away from mere external acts and into a relationship with God where his love and truth shape every part of me. As Dallas Willard says, the aim of spiritual formation is not behavior modification, but the transformation of all aspects of myself. The aim of it is not behavior transformation, change, where externally we just change and modify. But it's a transformation from the core of me to all of me. Is this a quick thing? Is this a quick fix? Is it a magic zap? No. It's a journey. Right? I didn't prepare this slide, but Tim Keller's exposition of the gospel is we're more sinful than we ever dared to believe about ourselves, but we're also at the very same time more loved than we could have ever wildly imagined or hoped for. And so it's like this discovery as we walk this journey of faith. It's this humbling process of realizing, oh man, I'm so much more jacked up than I thought I originally was. And without his grace, I see it more. But in that space, instead of despairing and deconstructing, I'm opening to God and coming to God afresh and re-encountering his love and being transformed in that process. It's relational. You see, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, it says, "And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit." The true transformation that happens in one degree as we behold Jesus, as we look at him and encounter him, we're transformed in that. As we come in face to face with God, we become transformed more and more like him, and it's through his Spirit. For this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. Transformation happens through the Spirit. It's not through more knowledge. It's not through more service. It's not through more good deeds. It's not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit of God that our formation takes place through the seasons. It's through the moments and through the seasons. God takes us through the moments and through the seasons. But it's relational at the core, my transformation with God. Through the moments, through the seasons. Through my serving, through discipline, through my knowledge. These are all things that bring me closer to God. But it's his Spirit that changes me. It's by his Spirit. And so in our passage today, in verse 1, it says, "Now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw the disciples eating with their hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed." And they picked a fight with Jesus, right? We see the Pharisees, right? The context of our passage today. So many miracles, so many wonderful teachings. So many people are looking for Jesus. They're coming towards Jesus. And just from touching his cloak, people are healed from terminal illnesses. And so there's wonderful things that are going on. Yet, the Pharisees, what do they focus on? They can't get past. They can't really taste and appreciate the miracles. They're just waiting for a moment to be like, yo, you're not keeping the law. Let's pause and think about this for a second. The thing that the Pharisees want to pick out of all of the wonderful ministry that Jesus is doing is they want to pick a matter that's a religious ritual. It's an external action, and it can be even seem very trivial and ridiculous, right? But it's like that's what they wanted to fight Jesus over. This is kind of a terrible, I don't want to say terrible example. It might be, I don't know how this example would go, but I've just noticed coming to Korea that the bathroom cleanliness standard is not the same. I've seen more, I don't know if the men can attest to this, but I've seen more people not wash their hands after the, is this TMI? For the women, it might be TMI, but it's like, I wanted to illustrate a point. It's like, man, I see sometimes people just walk out and then wash their hands. I'm like, don't you go to kimbap, Jung-gu can serve my kimbap, you know what I mean? Like, it's like the washing hands can be something that's not done as much here in the older generation. I don't know what it is. But it's like maybe something like that. I see that and we witness that. We're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to make it my life's goal to set up CCTV in every bathroom. And I'm going to pass laws. I'm going to put a sign everywhere. And I'm going to make this in this next upcoming election year. Like, this is going to be an absolute point in which we, like, if my party does not support this change and this reform, I'm boycotting this, you know? And so it's like, it's almost like that. It's like that, where it's like, yo, this is so terrible that I'm going to make a law, and this is everything. We're going to put our life on this. Maybe a more relevant example for our church context. We know that the statistics say that more Christians today don't read the word, pray less, give less, serve less, attend less. And so there's all these statistics about Christian behavior where people are just not praying, not giving, not doing the basics of what it means to be a Christian. And so maybe the reform or the response to that is hyper-focus on that. Maybe we need more stricter accountability systems. Maybe we need to be a little bit more forefront. Maybe we need to create more systems that put checks and balances that people are actually praying and actually reading the word and actually giving and actually doing these things. And maybe we can like hyper focus on these things, believing that these things will ultimately transform and help everyone. But are you guys tracking with this? The Pharisees, they're caught up in the religious rituals. They emphasize the externals. But Jesus, through this passage, in his sharp rebuke, he's highlighting that it's not the outward rituals, but it's the transformation of the heart that is what matters the most. Professor in Tarbert, his name's Jung-gu, and he says, the easiest answer to the human problem is moralism. The easiest answer that humans have towards the sin, guilt, and shame problem is just moralism. It's kind of a trap. The solution to our problem is just to be better. Be a better person. Live for better things. Do more good things. Live for better causes. Live a good life. Have a code of ethic. And if we can just be good enough, maybe we'll feel less shame or guilt. This is humanity's common answer over all different cultures. We choose to be good because we feel bad inside. Because we feel shame, because we feel guilt, we try to compensate for that by living a good life, hoping that it will be good enough. But this is not what Jesus is calling them into. Jesus is saying, I'm not interested in your goodness. I'm not interested in behavior modification. I'm inviting you into a relationship where there is transformation of my heart. Transformation that only happens in relationship with God. So, what's the problem? What's the problem then? If it's just relationships, why is it so hard? I think even back in the day with the Judaism, they created a system, they had a culture, they had a movement. They had all these different laws, they had systems, they had a pattern and a way of living. It was all for God, but it was without God. It was all for God. God, we're doing this for you. God, we're trying to be righteous before you. God, I want to be good for you. But all of these systems and cultures and movements were actually part of the system that insulated them from truly encountering God in their hearts. In verse 6, it says, verse 6 of our passage, it says, and he said to them, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And you leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your own tradition. The finest Judaic organization. They were the most faithful. They were so amazing in so many ways. They tithed doubly. They fasted twice a week. They memorized scripture from a young age. They had high standards of what it meant to be a Pharisee. Yet, there was a huge indictment against them. You have the respect of man. You have these systems in place. But your heart, it's revealed by your questions, by your interpretations, by your way of life. You give, you worship, you teach, but it's all in vain. And it's reminiscent of Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 to 23, where Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. And so it's like, man, there is this temptation. There is this way in which we can do these things in the name of God. But in vain, we do these things. Our hearts are not really in relationship with God. Our hearts have not opened to the gospel and the grace of God. and we don't know what it means to just allow the grace of God to fill our hearts. We're not saved by our works. And not only are we not saved by our works, but we're not sanctified by our works either. Now, there's a quote by, this is the final Dallas Willard quote that I'll share with you guys, but it's a quote that says, grace is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning. So, it's not that we don't do any work and we just float in life. It's not that we don't read the word or try at all to change out our lives or repent and turn from the things that are toxic in our lives to really press towards the goals and the direction that God has called us to. But it's the matter of the heart. So how do you discern what's earning and what's effort? Because our transformation requires effort on our part. When we're dealing with sins that are deep-rooted and things that are even generational, passed on from how we grew up, like if you guys have ever fought through an addiction and won through that addiction, it's like you have to fight tooth and nail to be free from that. Even when Jesus has set you free from drugs and whatever those things, if you're in an environment, you have to bring yourself out of that environment. So grace doesn't leave us just lazy. Grace moves us, and we try and we fight. But it's the idea of earning. If there is still an ounce of self-righteousness in me, if there's still an ounce of I can do this, and there is more than an ounce in me, if there's anybody else that feels that way. And it's through the trials and through the journey, through the seasons of life that God reveals these areas. The things that I trust, the things that I've banked my identity on, the things that I've really trusted above God. And in His grace, He progressively reveals those things about ourselves. He doesn't just show us all of our junk at once because we might despair. But it's like through people, through relationships, through circumstances, God is always revealing areas of our life that are still holding so tightly. Financial security, my image, my future, my children. Like these things we hold, and God in His grace, like children, He lets us hold those things. But it's in His love and grace that He invites us into the path of sanctification. More and more, He invites us. Will you let go of that? Will you step into faith? Will you trust in me? That even if you let go of that, I'll be with you. That even as you recognize, oh, I do trust money too much. Oh, I do trust image too much. Oh, I trust, and as these things are revealed, am I opening to God? Am I being honest with it? Because if I'm not, then without my awareness, a lot of it's earning. A lot of it's checks and balances, addition, subtraction. God, I did this for you. God, I served for you. God, I was at church. I was on praise team. I did this. I tithe. I did. But we're going through this hardship right now. One of my kids are sick, and you can't help us. Checks and balances. I feel like I've done more for you to deserve what others get that they don't deserve. And it's like without even knowing, the earning is there. And it's when the revelation of through circumstances and hardships, our hearts are revealed. How do we respond? How do we open to Him? How do we, when we serve so hard for God and we burn out, and God comes gently after we've burnt out and He said, you know, you didn't have to do it that much. You know I still love you. You know there's nothing that I feel about you that's changed. But oftentimes it's like when I've served so hard and you're broken and you're down, you don't feel like God loves you. Is it just me? God, so much of my relationship with God was based on what I did for Him and what I felt like I accomplished. But when God takes that away and I'm just there, do I really believe that He loves me? We go through seasons. And God comes to us in every season. And He's inviting us into a relationship where we encounter His grace afresh. It's a constant journey of walking into grace. I was saved purely by grace. And I am continuing this journey purely by grace. It's His grace that leads us. But for some reason, I think I'm saved by grace, and now, God, thank you for saving me. I'll show you that I want to show you and everyone else that you made a really good investment in me. And let me go now. And you just start sprinting. And it's like, God's like, no. I think you're misunderstanding. You were saved by grace, and I'll continue to carry you by grace. It's by grace. That's how I connect with God and stay in relationship with God. Because I know that even my best, even my moral ethic code and my body of work for God, that is not any footing for my righteousness. If I stand on that for my righteousness, it will all crumble. And surely it will fall. You see in our passage today in verse 10, the korban, or in verse 11, the korban was his gift. It literally means offering or gift devoted to God. And in Jewish law and tradition, korban allowed people to dedicate something to the Lord, whether it was property or money. And if it was dedicated to the Lord, then it couldn't be touched by anybody else. And so the Pharisees were abusing this by saying this is given unto God, but they were neglecting all of their other commitments to their family members and to their parents especially. And under the Judaic law, it was the fifth commandment is to honor your father and your mother, to look after them. And so what they were doing was they were evading their responsibility of helping their parents, which was huge in that culture. And they found a loophole to give more to the church, to find more respect and honor, to give under the guise of piety, so that people would be like, whoa, you're giving so much. And so by highlighting this korban tradition, Jesus is just pointing to one issue that's part of a broader issue when it comes to the Pharisees. They were distorting and obscuring God's commandments for their own benefit. It was a legalistic approach. It was superficial. It was ignoring the heart of the matter. It was ignoring the spirit of the law. They were doing the law, but they weren't really fulfilling the spirit of it, which was honor, blessing. The korban wasn't even given by God. They kind of made it. And so they missed God's heart. Because God's heart and God's law are always connected. God's spirit and law go together. But what man does is we rip the spirit out of it, and we do what's right, bare minimum on the law. If it benefits us, we do it, but we ignore the spirit of it. And the spirit of it is that for God, it was a heart of justice, mercy, and compassion that he said, honor your parents in their old age, right? And so they ignored the spirit of it. They ignored the spirit of the law, and they made beneficial for themselves. What is God calling us to? What's Jesus calling us to in the midst of all of this? He's saying, I believe that he's using the example of these Pharisees and saying, examine where your hearts might be. Don't let anything distract yourself from the heart of worship. Don't let religious performance, approval of man, fear of man, don't let those things supersede genuine love for God and care for others. Don't miss the point of church. Whether you've been in church for 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, don't ever lose. Fight to keep your heart of worship where you're not more concerned with what you do for God as much as you're concerned with your heart and your connection with God. And here is where it hits close to home for all of us, is how often do we use religious duty or even good intentions as a way to avoid the deeper and more difficult responsibilities God has placed in our lives? How often do we use religious duty or even good intentions as a way to avoid the deeper, more difficult responsibilities that God has placed in our lives? Maybe we hide behind serving at church so that we don't have to confront the brokenness in our family or confront the brokenness from within. We might stay busy with ministry to avoid quiet moments with God where he wants to do real work in our hearts. The Pharisees used korban as a loophole to avoid caring for the parents. But we all have our own ways of avoiding the hard stuff, the deep stuff, the real stuff that we're going through in our lives. So what does that mean for us today as a church? I think it means that we have to ask some hard questions. Are we more focused on doing things for God, and when we're not doing things for God, it's hard to be with God? Are we relying on our rituals and what we've done in the past to feel right with Him? Or are we opening to the Spirit of God, to the Word of God, to truly transform our hearts, to meet us where we're at? Spiritual formation is not just about looking good on the outside. It's about letting God shape us from the deep within to who He's called us to be. It's slow, it's steady, but it's from one degree to another, one degree of glory to another. He is able to do it because He has called us to it. And so just like 4 practical ways before we close, it's just one is regularly examining our hearts. It's a good practice. Are there areas of my life where I've focused more on the tradition or I've just the way that things are done, status quo? And are there ways that I'm doing that now in this season? It's a good point of examining our hearts. Number 2, practical, is integrate faith as a lifestyle. Like faith is not just what I do on Sundays. It's not just religious practice, but it's a lifestyle. Integrating my life, all of my life, as a journey of faith. The mundane moments as I drop off my kids, mundane moments where I'm doing just work, dead work at work, lunch breaks, like all of my life, my travel back home as I'm on the subway. Instead of using that as dead time where I'm just zoning out, I use that to engage with God. Pray for people, pray for church, pray for those in my life. Integrate faith into all of your life. Keep building, even if it's just 1 degree every day. Pray for one more person. Be open to one more conversation. Integrate faith, not just as a time where we do it at church, but in every part of our lives. Number 3 is prioritize relationships. Actually, I removed number 4, so this will be the last one. Jesus' rebuke of the korban tradition reminds us that spiritual formation cannot ignore the relational component. The relational component and the relational responsibilities in our lives are huge. And so like one practice that we could have is to not see our faith as just an individual thing, but how am I engaging with my other brothers and sisters in my faith? How am I growing? Am I engaged? Do I have mentors speaking into my life? Do I have older men and women that I look to, that I ask to pray for me? Help me with my decisions. Am I living my life just by myself, kind of lone soldiering it? Because if that's so, then it's not going to be possible for the long haul. Practice relationship, whether it's with people or with others. Relational is everything. You have to be connected. And so I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. My challenge to you this week is just reflecting on what are some areas of my life. Where in your life have you been relying on outward actions rather than inward transformation? What are the areas of your life right now that God has maybe inviting you to surrender, control? And maybe we could do that today. Just as we go into a time of prayer, we could just play quietly here. And just a time of just reflecting. What are some ways that I've maybe placed ritual and practice or history above my relationship with God? And what are some areas of my life that I've failed to be honest with God because I felt like maybe this is an area that I need to figure out and it's not really something that I want to share with God. But maybe today, through this passage, maybe there's an invitation for you to open that up, space to God, and just start day 1. God, this is where I've been. This is what I see in me. And this is what I sense maybe you inviting me into. Maybe we just spend a quick moment here just responding to the word as the Spirit leads us.